Okay, sige. So here's the thing, right? That I E O exists in what we call in our course the political core, right? So we assume there is a, sige, define natin. There is a decision making body. The assumption is that there's someone in charge, right? And for the most part, communities have not been democratic. More complex societies are not egalitarian. They tend to be highly hierarchical, or they have differentiations between leaders. In the case of the Philippines, leaders, free men, and also slaves. So it's not a very equal society, or there aren't a lot of avenues for, how would we say this, arbitration by people who are slaves, for instance. So we're not talking about a democracy here. We're not even talking about a modern nation state. We're simply talking about a system that has a decision making body that has a level of stability. Right? So it can be identified. You know there's a name for it, and you know that in historical sources, it's something that's mentioned that continues to exist. Right? So it exists. And it has a decision making body. So that's the political core. But what influences politics? What influences decision making? There are, yeah. In our model, there are two things that affect, or two general areas that affect decisions. Decision making body. On one side, you have uh, economy or economic relationships. Economic, how do you say this? Economic resources that shape a certain society and the dynamics that come from that. Okay. And here you have culture, right? Now, we had several examples for this, and I'd like you to think along with me now while I ask you the questions that we went through earlier. Now, imagine we're looking at the political decision making body, the political core, during the Spanish colonial era, right? Spanish colonial era. What economy, what economies, what economic resources affected, or yeah, affected our policies? And what cultures affected Spanish colonial policies, right? So, example one, EG1, Spanish colony, right? Spanish colony. Let's start with the easier one, culture. What culture highly influenced the way they would colonize us? Yeah? From Bajo de la Campana, friar power, and patronato real, we see that Christianity had a very, very big role to play in the kinds of policies that would be implemented here. For instance, under the policy of Patronato Real, which, if you don't remember what that is, that's the relationship between the crown and the church of Spain and the Roman Catholic religion, where they agreed that friars would help be foot soldiers in colonization. And we don't mean, well, sometimes they would be literal like commanders of a militia, but in most cases, they were the people who were most populous. Sila yung pinakamaraming maipapadala sa isang bagong teritoryo, di ba? So they were actually the majority of people you would find in rural areas in the Philippines, for instance. You don't see soldiers, you see friars, padres, or frailes, right? So Christianity affected how we were colonized. And if you were going to be colonized, you were there, you're a native, you've existed here in Agoo ever since, before the Spanish arrived. When you were converted from someone who was not colonized to someone who was colonized, the person who did that was the friar by virtue of baptizing you. Once you were baptized, you were now formally going to live in a pueblo, a town, or a reducción, somewhere that had been reorganized for the Spanish to control you easier. And what was the center of the reducción of the pueblo, or well, of the cabecera? The center of this new new spatial urban system was the church, right? So obviously, we were very, very deeply affected by Christianity and the way we were colonized under Spain. Now let's talk about the economy. Why did the Spanish stay in the Philippines? And often we'll think about gold god glory, right? But we don't really have a lot of gold, or the Spanish weren't able to extract enough gold to stay in the Philippines. So they didn't stay for gold. And as much as glory is an important reason to colonize, they didn't really stay for glory either. Nor did they stay specifically just to Christianize, because they could have done that in other places of the world. They stayed because of a commodity they found here, being traded here. And no, it's not spices, it's silk and porcelain, right? So, because of our trade connections to the world outside of the Philippines that already existed, we had a direct trade relationship with Oriental economies such as China and Japan. And the Spanish were especially interested in Chinese goods such as silk and porcelain. So much so that galleon trade emerged with two main commodities being traded. So, galleon trade, what did it trade? Remember? SS, silk and silver. Yeah, silk and silver. Okay, so my argument is that economically, there wouldn't even be a political core in the way it was structured, centered in Manila. Why was it centered in Manila? Because that's the biggest port of trade between the Chinese and the natives that carried silk and porcelain. The other major center of trade, which was in Sulu, well, for one thing, there was already a large polity controlling the area, but secondly, they didn't have as much silk and porcelain, right? The closer area of trade was really Manila. So the fact that the administrative core was set up in Manila was not a random decision. It was a decision made because of the galleon trade economy and the silk and silver exchange that was global in nature. So, how did it affect the political core? Political core might not exist without the galleon trade. Okay, so that's an example, no? In the Spanish colonial era, we see how culture and economy affect the way the system is structured and how people make decisions and what their priorities are. Hi. I looked at my mask and I thought it was the eraser, but it's not the eraser. Okay, let's do another contrast to this now. Example 2. Sorry. So alam na natin to. There's a decision-making body. It has a level of stability. It's identifiable. So, kulit. Yan. Culture. All right. Example number 2. Sultanates. Okay. Basic assumption. Sultanates are political entities where one of the most important ways of life is Islam. And it affects not only what you eat, but also how your politics is shaped, right? So, safe to say, culturally, although it's not just Islam, it's a very particular kind of Southeast Asian Islam that reaches us. Either way, it's still a version of Islam, right? Islam, a way of life and a way of politics, affects the Sultanate's political core. How? Who can rule? Sultan. We'll talk about this more later, right? So, in order to rule this system, in order to become the Sultan, the head of the political core, you need to have a genealogy that traces your ancestry back to Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad in the Middle East, right? So, your method of rule is very deeply affected. But there are other reasons, right? You have the you have adat laws, and you have like, what is it? Sharia laws, and like a bunch of other laws that affect how you're ruled. But from the get-go, who can rule is already defined by your political culture. Now, what about your political economy? Now, you probably don't know this yet, but one of the biggest activities that led to the growth of sultanates and made them competitive against the Spanish and the Dutch was something we're already familiar with: raiding, pangangayaw. And of course, trading, because why would you raid slaves if you're not going to collect materials for the slaves to eventually sell? So it was like a system that fed in on itself. They raided a lot of slaves for their own economic extraction, and they also sold the slaves for other polities' economic extraction, right? So uh, that directly led to the structure of how they would raid. Earlier, the people who were here with me had to see me attempt to draw a source of history, a primary source that we don't often use. It's not textual, and it's actually a karakoa, right? Okay, so I'm attempting to draw the karakoa again, hopefully with better results this time. Okay, yeah. Oh, okay, yeah, that's much better. Yeah, much better. So let me draw this first, right? Let's erase the item under here. If you remember from a 1711 depiction in Bartolome something's like, I don't know, travels to the Philippines, they drew a Caracoa, which is a warship. Let's label that, right? So that's the Caracoa. And the Caracoa, if you remember from the image in our slides, if you don't remember, just look at the image in our slides. It has people here, yeah, or captured people here and people here. Yung mga nagsasagwan. Okay, so we're still talking about pangangayaw because this is the primary raiding vessel. How do we know? Because the central area was used to keep slaves that they had just acquired or had just kidnapped. The right word is kidnapped. So they kidnap these people, they put them here. These are the warriors, slaves. And interestingly enough, these people are also slaves, right? Esclava. So, um, the entire economic system, the entire political system of the sultanates was wide. And the very bottom of that political system relied on their ability to get slaves. And how would they get slaves? They would have raiding parties with I think it was called a laut, something like a commander laut, sea captain. Yeah. Sea captain. And the sea captain would organize slaves that they already had to row the boats, to become the warriors, and to take more slaves. So that's interesting because if you think about it, on the lowest level, the ability of the system to continue existing and have more resources depends on them continuously having slaves that they can acculture. We'll talk about this more later. Yung parang they become part of your system and they become willing to raid other communities to help your system out. So, yun, no, very interesting stuff, but we'll talk about it later. So the way your political core is structured depends on how you structure your slaves, yeah, and how you decide on who the captain of these raids is and which allies you're going to make in order to keep those connections going and keep the slaves coming in and other trade items continuing to come in. Okay, so that's the second example, and we're gonna stop there because we should be more or less familiar now with our modified political systems approach. Okay, so there's input, right? There's input. You meet the Spanish. What do? There's process. You fight them Or there's process. You talk amongst yourselves, you negotiate, there's outcome. Do you become allies or do you fight them? So all of this is informed by your political culture and your political economy, in addition to your actual structure of rule.